Okay, but first of all, I'd like to set a bit of context. So to tell you what I think, and I'm doing a double team effort here with Emma Moran from Southland, so hopefully she thinks the same thing, about what economics is. So it's not about dollars, it's not about GDP. All of those things are important to it, but it's much broader than that. We need to think much more broadly. For me, economics is about people and about the choices that they make and why they make them. Sometimes that's because of dollars, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not, but you can measure it in dollars. We're also not starting with a blank slate, so you can't come at it all the time like sometimes I would like to, with some economic models, and apply them in a nice hermetically sealed economist's world. We're operating in the real world. So there's a whole lot of regulatory context that we are operating in. So the Treaty of Waitangi is a very important one in our region, where we have the Waikato Settlement Act, which gives us a vision and strategy for the Waikato River, which has precedence over the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management in terms of setting targets and limits. There is also, obviously, of course, the NPS, the NZCPS, the RMA, the LGA, and any other number of letters that you want to throw at it. We're also dealing with some really specific geographical contexts. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit later will be different to the context that Emma's talking about and Chris will be talking about. That's driven by the geography and the physical environment, but also about the communities, the people who live there and the aspirations that they have, the things that they value and why they make the choices that they do. So one thing I've as well is one of the reasons why we're doing economics in this space is to try and get to the point where when decision makers need to make a call about this is what the limit should look like for this particular water body, we've got the capacity to give them the answers about what that means for people and for the environment and for the wider region as well. And of course Section 32 is the bit of the RMA that is quite specific about some of the economics work that needs to be done. I think the traditional sort of approach to Section 32 that many policy folks have taken is a bit like my reaction to Brussels sprouts. You try and do as little as possible and maybe brush it under the plate next door. But I think to get good decisions at the end of the day, you need to do really good economics. And you can't do it at the end. It needs to be done from the start. What it's supposed to be is a record of all the analysis that you've done to get to the point where decision makers can make their decision. It's not to try and validate decisions after the fact. There's several different ways in which I think of economics as being able to apply in the policy space. The first one, in the context that we're talking about now, is whereabouts should the limits be? You can talk about the benefits and costs of particular targets or limits, and at what point is the costs of further improvement more than the benefits that you get from that further improvement. You can also use it to think about how to design your policy instrument. So once you've decided what your target and limit is, there's different ways of getting there. And economics can tell you what the most cost-effective way might be. and also about distributional effects. Who should bear the cost? It may or may not be the person who has to make the change to achieve a target. And there's also something about managing expectations, I think. We can provide wonderful economic models with great reports that have interesting numbers in them. But when you're interpreting it, you need to be a bit careful. There's limits to what that information can tell you. So they might be able to tell you the relative magnitudes of effects. They're not going to tell you absolutely down to dollar and cents what the costs are versus what the benefits are, which would be nice for decision makers if we could, but that's just not the way the world works. This is where I hand over to my colleague.
Okay, so the first point I really wanted to make is that doing economics, it really is new territory for regional councils. It's not our usual business. Usually it's, traditionally you've got a whole big science team, you've got policy, compliance and consents, and there's a lot of work that goes on, but they haven't really got into the economic space in any way. So people like myself and Blair are a bit of an aberration in regional councils. I don't think I'm at a yes by design. I think I happened accidentally to them. But they like me for all that, I think. So for regional councils to do economics is a real challenge. They don't have that capacity that they have already established to do science and the other work that they've been into in the past. So what Blair and I have been working on is creating a capacity to do economic work within regional councils, and that actually has to be demand driven. So whatever we're doing, the economic work that we're doing, it has to be relevant, it has to fit the problem. Regional councils get into trouble when they go out and buy something, when it's supply driven, they get sold something by a consultant and they don't necessarily know any better, and they can I just adjust this?
Sure.
Okay. And it can be quite an expensive way to go about stuff. But one of the key things I really wanted to get across today is that for regional councils to do this work, and you all want us to do this work, that it actually requires us to have access to data, access to the understanding that you all know about your different sectors, and helping us feed that into our economic work, and that requires a lot of trust, which isn't ordinarily how people think about regional councils. We're going to talk about two big projects that we're doing in a minute, one in Waikato and one in Southland, but first I wanted to make a point that economic work within a regional council, it doesn't always have to be big. I get accused of always wanting the Rolls-Royce version, but actually sometimes you can use number 8 wire, you can use existing knowledge within a regional council, and you can build something like a Taranaki Gate. And it's not perfect, but it does the job. The example I've got for that is that a couple of years ago we had a regional steering group. They've been talking about riparian management for quite a while, and everybody knew they were talking about the economic impacts, and they were big, but nobody really had a sense of how big they were. So I sat down over a couple of days and just using Excel built a bit of a riparian management cost calculator for the different sectors. So obviously the cost of dairy fencing versus sheep and beef or deer fencing is completely different. We figured out how many riparian lengths there are across the region, and figured out how much it was actually going to cost the region, ballpark figure, and just sort of trying to quantify that a wee bit. And the number we came up with for, we were looking at land use classes 1, 4, across the region, because we've got 36,000 kilometres worth of both sides of the waterways within those land use classes, was sort of ballpark between $150 to $200 million, just depends. And we also had a look at being able to play around with different buffer zones and plantings and that sort of thing. But the point is that we had that knowledge. It was just a matter of actually pulling it together and using it for to inform a particular group who had some questions. It wasn't a big deal. So while we were looking for number 8 wire, so Waikato and Southland, obviously at different ends of the country, councils are facing real challenges with water quality. We're both working to create that capability that I was talking about in advance of limit setting. We're both really trying hard to work with others in how we do that economics. We are looking at catchment and regional impacts, so direct economic impacts and those wider indirect impacts that we heard about earlier from New Zealand. We're also both looking at point source and non-point source, so it's not just agricultural work. We're looking at the discharges that come from towns and what they might have to do to increase their levels of service. But key to make today was that we're doing the legwork, the homework in advance of actually the catchment limit setting before we get it into that decision-making space. Because it's pretty hard to invent all this at the time. So both can't be quite significant investment to get it right, but each council is doing it differently. A key thread for me is that in looking at your regional catchment and your regional impacts, your point source and non-point source, that you're actually trying to make sure that you can show to communities that the urban sector depends on the rural sector, and the rural sector equally, the rural community depends on your urban community. And if you can't show that, then you're not actually going to get past that rural-urban divide. You need to be able to explain to people that we're all in it together and show them, because people don't make the link.
Okay, so now just going to run through a little bit of the work that we've done. Now in the Waikato, we started quite a long time ago. In fact, it was probably about the same time as the original LORF process wrapped up. There's a whole bunch of things going on at that stage. There's the LORF report. I think Horizons One Plan had just come out of the Environment Court, and central government was having a think about how they would change the NPS to include the National Objectives Framework and that sort of thing. So we entered into a joint piece of work which included central government and ourselves, the Waikato River Authority, and Dairy and Z were the main partners, but others were involved along the way as well. And we got together to try and build that capacity that Emma was talking about, so that when our Healthy Rivers Plan change came along, we'd be in a position to answer the questions. And find myself in a situation where we spent a long time getting our collaborative stakeholders grouped together, and for them to come together and then come to the technical people and say, what would it look like to have a target like this? And the technical people say, come back in 2 years and we'll tell you. So we decided to get started a bit early. So this is it's the longest river in New Zealand, so barring a satellite picture, I couldn't find one that captured the whole thing. But this is the confluence of the Waipa and Waikato rivers at Ngaruawahia, and it's a point in the river that you can stand and feel all the influences coming from the different places. So to the west, up the right hand side there, that's the Waikato River that goes up to the King Country. There's a lot of hill country, steep hill country up there, on karst land, and there's a lot of sediment issues that are coming down that river. Up the other side, to the east, is the Waikato River. There are eight hydro dams on that river, and it provides a pretty significant chunk of New Zealand's electricity. But also those dams are a lot of recreational activity that goes on up there. There's also various other sort of industry and communities based along the river or that use it. I haven't even mentioned the big farming industry that's based there. Horticulture is further down the river predominantly towards the end, and forestry at the top. So it kind of encompasses all of the different issues and all of the different effects that we need to try and think about, which is a bit of a monstrous job. So that's just another way of looking at the whole thing. These are some catchment management units starting at Lake Taupo, working down the river through Hamilton and the bits between Karapiro and Ngarawahia. Number 4, the green bit, is the Waipa catchment. We've got shallow lakes to deal with as well, which are have their own particular issues again, so lots of different stuff going on. So the work that we did, we started out to try and build a model of the catchment. This was, you've probably heard some variants of this kind of model over the last day or so. Essentially what it does is try and work out a baseline of all the land uses, and as well as point sources that are feeding into the river, and represent those as farm models or forestry models or whatever. And the aim of the model is to try and maximise the profitability that can be earned from this land, subject to whatever constraints you decide to put on it. So you can say if there's a particular target of X, you plug that into the model, it works its way back through and says, here's the range of mitigations that might be needed to roll out across this part of the catchment. And that may be anything from very cheap ones, which it starts off the cheap ones and works its way to progressively more expensive ones. At the more expensive end, you tend to have things like land use, conversion to forestry, that sort of stuff. But we also were quite conscious that once we had that kind of model, which could answer certain questions about the cost effectiveness of particular targets and limits, we were only thinking about costs and only to land users, which is an incredibly important part of the regional economy. There are other issues as well. So we started off by having a look at the range of recreational and other uses that people had for freshwater in the catchment. This was based on a survey of about 3,000 people, 3,000 respondents, who said, this is where I go to use freshwater in the region or in the catchment. This is what I use it for. This is where I come from. So from that, that in itself provides you a whole lot of rich information about the values that people have for it. You can then also infer a lower bound of the way that people value that by saying, well, if you're prepared to travel from Auckland to Karapiro, then that has to be worth a certain amount for you to give up your time and spend some petrol money to go and do that. So they may have been willing to spend even more, so it acts as a kind of a lower bound, but useful information, I think, for someone who's trying to weigh up what those recreational values might look like as well. While we were doing this, as part of the survey, we also included some questions about the values that Tanga Whenua had for freshwater catchment. It quickly became apparent to us that these kinds of non-market valuation techniques probably aren't very useful for trying to define and put a value on those kinds of values. So we had an additional bit of our project that essentially what we wanted to do was say, we've recognised that these are a really important set of values. It was beyond the scope of what we were doing at the time, but to try and do more. So we went and collected all the information that we could from every published source available. We went to iwi, and so at least what we were able to do was categorise a set of values that the river iwi had for freshwater in the catchment. As well as that, there's another set of modelling that can sit over the top of that, which we're using. You can use either input-output models or computable general equilibrium models, which you may or may not have heard about over the last day or so. But essentially what they do is take the kind of inputs that we've talked about and say, well, here's what that means for the wider economy. So understanding what the effect of targets and limits are for farm incomes is important, but those changes in farm incomes might have a big knock-on effects further down the road with people who supply farmers and all those kinds of things. So that's a really important sort of layer that needs to sit over the top to understand all of those values that Section 32 now quite explicitly says you need to be saying what this means for economic growth and employment in the region. I mean, those are kinds of things that I would have said we should have been doing all along, but they're now quite explicit in there as well. So there's a whole lot of different kinds of information there. We've got our catchment modelling, we've got our non-market values, we've got non-priced cultural values, and then as a health warning, if anyone suffers from migraines, you might want to look away from the next slide. Because this is a little bit what it feels like when you start to try and put it all together. It's a very complex thing, and what we're trying to do is bring some order to order our thinking so that we can be quite explicit about the things that we value and the reasons why we're making the decisions that we are. And it's important because people are going to have to make potentially big changes as a result of this.
Southland, 3.2 million hectares, half of it's in conservation state, centring on Fiordland and the islands. The other half is productive land, pretty much. And that productive land is dominated by 4 major river catchments. We have the Waia, Aparima, Areti and Mataura. And then there are a lot of smaller catchments further closer to the sea as well. Our rivers run north to south, and just to add an extra layer of complexity, we have unconfined groundwater aquifers which tend to run east to west, and I'm constantly being told by our scientists that we can claim the most complex geology in the country. So that one there is the Reti. I'm pretty sure this is Lake Tiana. I checked with Rob and he was about as clear as I was on it. We have a lot of natural state lakes in Southland, and we have two pretty important ones, Lake Tiana and Maungapori, and most of you won't be old enough, but back in the 70s, we had Save the Man. 71. I didn't want to assume. It was Save the Manapori campaign. We got 200,000 people in New Zealand signing a petition to save a lake that they've probably never been to and probably weren't ever going to get the chance to go to. So these lakes have national and international values. We're also lucky enough to have estuaries. This one's New River Estuary. It sits right beside Invercargill City. It's called Invercargill's Playground, and it's in serious trouble. But we have more than 20 estuaries across the region. Most of our catchments empty into either a coastal lake or a lagoon or an estuary of some sort. And these estuaries are included in our freshwater management units, which I think, as the PCE noted on Friday, is not usual for the FMUs. We have N and P and sediment and E. coli issues across the region, varying water quality. We're already over-allocated in some areas, and as I understand it, Environment Southland is looking at setting both load and concentration limits. We're taking like ECAN and Mountains to the Sea approach, and our RPS, which has just had its decisions released, links coastal water quality to freshwater quality. So maintaining water quality within Southland is likely to be a significant challenge to the economy, and that's where our project comes in. So to recognise that challenge that the region's facing, we have set up this joint project with these core partners. The project sits within our Water and Land 2020 and Beyond project, which is itself a partnership with Te Ao Marama, which represent the four runanga in Southland and Ngāi Tahu. In my mind, having this core group of organisations representing this broad range of interests is a real strength to the project, because it's not just industry driven, you're actually getting that broad range of interests in there, and I think that at the end of the day it will give the wider community a sense of comfort about the way the work's being done. The starting point for us, we're focused on economic impacts, and we have to maintain water quality. So what we're looking at is the economic impacts of at least maintaining water quality. We already have the NPS. We don't have to justify why we need to do that. So we're not really in that cost-benefit analysis situation. If we are looking at improving water quality, then that will be where that comes in. But the values or the reasons or the benefits for managing water quality are being done separate to this project, unlike Blair, who was including the cost and the benefit side into it. A key element for me, and I cannot emphasise this enough, is time in the economic work. We have to do the economic work for water in a dynamic way. the economic impacts vary with time. It's a fundamental aspect of the NPS. How fast you go, how slow you go, how much time you give people to respond to change. If you go fast enough, I have a sense that the economic impacts could be worse than they may need to be. But if you go too slowly, you actually end up in that over-allocated situation, and your economic impacts at that point must just take on some exponential sort of nature. So that's taking that policy context of the NPS and the wider RMA as intergenerational. That's how you have to think about the economics when you're doing this work. So we're creating an ability to answer questions about economic impacts when we get to limit setting in a couple of years. We have 4 FMUs, 5 FMUs, so we're going to have 5 policy processes. They will be processes that run over a year or two, each one of them, so we have to actually provide information on an ongoing basis in different geographic areas, and that's pretty expensive, so we're actually trying to make a model that Environment Southland is able to use, that policy guys can use to test drive policy, see what happens, do sensitivity analysis that we've been hearing about, understand the uncertainty, understands what happens when you pull different policy levers, and actually build an understanding of the economy, because it's the building the understanding that is as important, if not more important, than whatever numbers it spits out. So for us, how we're doing this work is really, really important. We need this joint process, and we need to build that understanding. Council had an opportunity 18 months ago just to go ahead and do this work by itself, and it chose not to do that. So we're putting a significant investment in this, working with people to do it. So agriculture, I'm just going to flip through these slides. Southland is sheep and beef. Ben sitting over there, who's part of this project. We have 4.3 million sheep and 175 million beef cattle. We have some cows. Most of them are Frisian. I think there's about 700,000 at the moment. Some industry targets that I've heard are they want to get that number up to about 1 million. Southland has the greatest potential for conversions of any region in the country, and I think that's just the basis that everywhere else is full. At Fonterra's Edendale plant, massive expansion underway. They're looking at what's happening with the NPS and environment limit setting, but they're still charging on. It's not just sheep and beef and cows. It's a stronghold for the deer industry. I think we're second only to Canterbury with the number of deer, but we think we have more deer hectares. 240,000 deer, and when you put all those numbers together, you actually come up with about 10 million stock units in Southland. And that's roughly the same number as there were in 1990, but the impact of each stock unit is increasing. There are other primary industries. We have horticulture. We grow a lot of carrots in Southland. We have 2 key growers. They lease land. We have a lot of arable, a lot of dairy support. Our wintering lasts about 6 months in Southland. We have a lot of forestry. And So we're making a huge investment in actually understanding how all those different sectors work in Southland, because arable or sheep and beef or whatever it is different in Southland than it is to other regions, because they have to farm to the conditions and the environment that they're given in. So we're trying very, very hard to actually understand how these different sectors work in Southland, and that's one of the strengths of working with industry to get that understanding. And we, through this project, we can feed that into the policy process. We're spending about $500,000 surveying about 100 farms. We're making sure that we get a farm in every area across Southland so that we can actually look farmers in the eye and say, yes, we did a farm in your area. And we're trying really, really hard not to talk about representative farms or average farms, because as constantly is being pointed out to me, every single one of them are different. We want to talk about, we've done these farms, they're indicative of farming in this area. Your farm may be a bit like this one and might be a bit like that one over there. But getting the range is crucial. So we're creating cost abatement curves. We're using overseer and farmers to do that sort of work, just to build that relationship between the profitability and the mitigation options that each sector has available to them, and how their losses might be reduced. And we are working to ground truth that along the way with farmers so they can tell us what we're doing wrong. Okay, we're not just doing agricultural work, we're also having a municipal industrial study. We are doing a pile of working with Invercargill's City Council, Gore District Council, Southland District Council and some industry to understand that if they had to increase their levels of service, what the implications of that would be. We're trying to build, doing a set of community case studies covering 60 to 70% of the population. We want to understand the context of the wastewater and stormwater discharges within that community. We want to make community profiles that we can actually use when we put it all together. It's going to be an important part of the story. Once we survive all that, we want to look at the regional impacts. Supply chain, how our natural resource use flows through to manufacturing. At Frontiera, there are 1,000 jobs at the Edendale plant. Tiwai smelter, I think there's a similar amount. And Alliance Warrnambool's got 5,000 jobs on the line. So we have to pay attention. We're using a variety of measures, because one of the things I've learnt is that you can't hang everything off one measure. You can't just say GDP is this or value added or whatever, because depending on the measure that you use, it tells a different story. You need several measures to actually understand what's happening. And we are trying to make and read a model to understand that economy. We don't just want to have a set of scenarios that we analyse. Pretty expensive way to go. I'm Scottish down in Southland, so they don't want to give me any more money than I need. And as I touched on before, we really want to get past that rural-urban divide and bring it together in a way that people can actually understand that the values they have for water eventually come back and shape the community that they live in. So the last part of the project is to actually show how economic impacts flow through to social cultural impacts. And I think people don't really understand economics when it's got a dollar sign in front of it. They understand economics when you talk about people and their lives and their businesses and their opportunities, and you can paint a picture about their jobs and their schools and their local towns.
It's kind of just a bit of a summing up slide about some of the lessons that we've learned from the work that we've been doing over the last year. And we've sort of canvassed them all before, but you can't underestimate what's required to get good information about such a complex issue as this. especially when we're talking about whole catchments or whole regions, and all the different gnarly problems that you're trying to solve, or at least find the best way of dealing with them. So get started early. If you can see the issue coming up, even if you make some mistakes along the way, you'll get useful information from that as well. That information, we're not the keepers of that as economists or as regional councils. Everyone out there are the ones that have all the information that we need, and what we're trying to do is make the best decisions collectively. So again, you can't underestimate the amount of effort that's required to build and maintain those relationships. I can see a few people here from our collaborative stakeholder group that we have up in the Waikato. That's been sort of functioning for a year or so, I guess. But the genesis of it is 2 or 3 years ago. And it took a long time to get that set up right and working well. And we're inevitably going to be ending up in a situation where there's going to be scenarios that are put forward that have winners and losers. So it's a hard conversation sometimes. I guess as an economist, I retreat into the provider of information kind of role and say, this is just what the information says, you guys make the decisions, so you've got the hard job. And yeah, it's as Emma said, it's new territory. This level of economics hasn't been done before in the resource management space in New Zealand, and probably we're doing pretty well in terms of how the rest of the world does things as well. And so all of this working together and thinking and providing advice about the best ways to move forward in this space seems to be pretty much what the description of the Land and Water Forum is. So again, we're delighted to have been able to come and talk to you.